All right, let's see who remembers anything. This one might be tough. Who named the northern parts of America and the eastern coast of Canada Newfoundland? Named it Newfoundland. You may not have this in your notes, but...
John Cartier?
No. That's a good guess.
No.
Who?
No.
It's John. C-A-B-O-T, Cabot? 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 It's an English guy. John Cabot, named it Newfoundland. If you don't have that, that's not especially important. Why was employment one of the reasons why we see a lot of English colonists coming over? I mean, other than the fact that they were unemployed, what particular thing was creating the unemployment?
The free land that owns own property.
Okay, that is very true, but there's something else going on in England that creates the unemployment. Okay. Okay, they began to enclose their farms with fences and raise crops. Needed a whole lot fewer workers, and so a lot of people are getting displaced by that. So, all right, unemployment, one of the motivations there. From there, we talked about Jamestown and the formation of that colony. What change allowed for them to prosper? They got rid of communism, right? That's a good way to state it. It never, ever, ever works. It can't. It's like trying to, if you see some scientist come in explaining how he's going to make a solid lead ball float in the lake. Because you can't. I mean, it goes against nature. It's not going to float. He might make it seem like it's floating somehow with magnets or something, but it's not going to actually be floating in the water because it's just all that ball is going to sink to the bottom. It goes against nature, communism or socialism. It goes against the nature that God put into us, so it can't work. All right, what change allowed the Pilgrims at Plymouth to prosper? Got rid of communism. Very good answer. And we finished that up, didn't we? I remember looking at the Mayflower Compact. Yep. We talked about God taking care of them, eventually them jettisoning the common storehouse. Talked about Squanto and Samoset and some of those guys coming in. And then God takes care of the colony. And we talked about why it was important. They get swallowed up by a neighboring colony, but they are important nonetheless. All right, next thing I'd like to do is quickly run down through the 13 colonies. Well, kind of up there. The 13 colonies that eventually are developed here in North America. All right, the first one, just to have a complete list of 13, is Virginia, Jamestown. We've already talked about them, so we won't rehash it. Sometimes I just say, we already talked about Virginia, so we won't include it. And people ask me at the end, how come there's only 12? Where's So, Virginia, that's one of them, Jamestown. All right, the next one is Massachusetts. Massachusetts. And for a year for this one, 1630. 1630. We already talked about half of this. The first group here actually was the Pilgrims in 1620. They were a group of separatists. In 1630, there's a wave of Puritans that come over, and it's a large wave of Puritans that come over. There's a whole bunch of them. In 1630, 17 ships show up with 1,000 settlers to the north of where the Pilgrims were. I mean, so from the very beginning, they are vastly larger than the Pilgrims. And by the end of the 30s, there's 15,000 people there in this Massachusetts Bay Company colony in what is now Massachusetts. So anyway, they dominate very, very quickly. It's about 1790 when they officially swallow up the Plymouth colony and it all becomes one group. But in time, the Puritans there dominate. Let me give you at least one name beyond what we talked about. A guy named John Winthrop. He was the first governor of Massachusetts. W-I-N-T-H-R-O-P. John Winthrop. All right, so we have the separatists coming first, and then the Puritans coming and dominating. We talked about the religious freedom. There had been a change of the weather in England, and now the Puritans are a little bit more under the gun, so we see a wave of them leaving, much like we saw the separatists, the Puritans, or the Pilgrims, leaving 10 years earlier. So, all right, so we have Massachusetts. 1630 is usually referred to as the official year for them because that's when the Puritans came over. The Pilgrims did come in 1620 in basically the same geographic area. All right, the next colony is Maryland. All right, anybody know what religion dominates here, or at least was intended to dominate? Joanna? Catholicism. All right, is named after King Charles's wife Mary, a devout Catholic, Maryland. The guy who started the colony was a man named George Calvert, G-A-L-V-E-R-T. I'm sorry. He was the guy who wanted to start it. He actually dies, and his son starts it. His name is Cecilius Calvert. Yeah, I agree. They're much more well-known, or you might recognize their title. They're both Lord Baltimore. Okay, you might know of a city in Maryland that sounds familiar to that. Cecilius was his name. That's the son, that he actually is the one that starts it. George got the ball rolling. The thing's moving in that direction. Cecilius starts it. Okay. Calvert. C-A-L-V-E-R-T. Okay, one other comment here to make about Maryland, other than it was started for Catholics, is that not a whole lot of Catholics came. All right. So there began to be more Protestants of whatever stripe and flavor there than Catholics. So the Catholics started to be worried that they would be persecuted in their own colony. I mean, that would be especially ironic. So they, early on here in 1649, passed a law establishing some semblance of religion of freedom. It's called the Toleration Act of 1649. It's not quite complete religious freedom, but it's a big step in that direction. It granted freedom to anybody who professed to believe in Jesus Christ. Whatever stripe of Christianity, as long as it involved Christ, you were free. Catholic, Protestant, Puritan, Separatist, whatever.
What was the date for this foundation of Maryland?
I don't think I gave it to you, 1634. Okay, so the Toleration Act there, 1649, freedom to anyone professing Christianity. And even the name itself, it's toleration of these other religions. Not so much you're free to worship, it's that we'll tolerate it. You know, I could say I'll tolerate you guys using your computers in here. And that's different than complete freedom to bring them. So I really don't care if you bring your computers. Okay, so that's Maryland. Next one, Connecticut, 1636. And every good American remembers how to spell Connecticut. Anybody remember? At least I always learned connect, I cut. You punch somebody, you connect, I cut. Anyway, Connecticut, 1636. Okay, this is a splinter off of Massachusetts. We saw Massachusetts, the initial wave was 1,000. Within 10 years, there's 15,000. So very quickly, there's a lot of people there. 1636, we see a group split off, and they move over from the Massachusetts area to the Connecticut River Valley. The guy that does this is Thomas Hooker. He is a pastor, and he brings his congregation over there. And they move there in 1636. Once they arrive, they write the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's referred to as at least the first written constitution in the colonies. There were written documents before this time, but there were charters and things from the king. These people got together and wrote it themselves. It's another of those documents, if you get bored sometime, desperately bored, you can Google it and read it. It talks about how they have their town meetings and posting notices so many days in advance, and it actually gives the mechanics of how they run their government. It's not terribly long, but
What was the name of the document?
the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's not so much significant because it was such a grand and glorious scheme of government. It's the idea of them forming their own government that is significant. So. All right, so 1636, we see them split off. That's usually the date used to mark the beginning of Connecticut. But there's one other date here to mention, at least in significance. It's 1662. That's the year the king recognizes them as a separate colony. Before this time, there hadn't been a separate charter. 1662. There hadn't been a separate charter or anything actually splitting them off officially. We get that. The paperwork's cleared up here in 1662. It was Charles II that did this. Anybody know anything about the history of England? And about Charles II and what's going on in the world? Stephanie wants to answer. Charles I had his life cut short. He was beheaded. The people of England beheaded him, and then we have him doing very poorly, and then the English Civil War, which he loses and gets beheaded, and then we have Oliver Cromwell coming in with the Protectorate, and then they get tired of him because he goes crazy and his son doesn't do a good job, and they ask the king's son to come back, Charles II. Right? So there've been some that time in between there. You might think, well, it's a long time, but they were busy cutting their king's head off and other things, and it wasn't the right time to get him to push some paperwork through. Eventually, that's all settled. 1662, they get granted this permission to be a separate colony completely. All right, Connecticut. Next one is Rhode Island, also 1663. All right, this is another split off of Massachusetts. The guy who started this was Roger Williams. And he actually gets kicked out of Massachusetts. So he moves to what is now Rhode Island. And Roger Williams is his name. He moves to now what is Rhode Island and starts a city. Anybody know the name of the city? Providence, Rhode Island. Oh, sorry. We had almost a foreign student, somebody from Utah that wanted to answer too. So. All right, starts Providence, Rhode Island. There. Literally, he was referring there to God's protection. That's where the name Providence comes from.
Did you come up with the official title of Rhode Island, or did that come later?
I have no idea. Like the seal or the...
No, like the official title.
Oh, what is it?
The
I doubt
state
it.
of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, but I wonder
Probably
if
not.
that came on later.
Probably came along later. Yeah. He was kicked out. I did want to drop back and mention some things that he disagreed with Massachusetts about what got him kicked out. All right, some things that aren't that bad, really. All right, he first of all disagreed with him about the separation of church and state. He didn't think that the government and the church should be combined together into one entity. Basically, Massachusetts was known for persecuting people that disagreed with them and flogging dissenting ministers and that type of thing. Disagreed with that. He also disagreed about the Indians owning the land. He felt that they owned the land and we shouldn't just take it. We should talk to them and negotiate and somehow purchase the land from them. I agree with him to a point. It's really hard. The Indians had no concept of ownership of land. So you could talk to a chief of some tribe and, buy for certain people, negotiate and buy a hunk of land from him. And then all the people in his tribe would just say, oh no, I wasn't there at that meeting, so you have to buy it from me too. It was a little bit tough sometimes to really buy it from the Indians, but Massachusetts is basically taking the position, we're just going to take it. We're not going to even pretend like we're going to buy it from. And he's saying, no, we should try to buy it from the Indians. And then the third thing he disagreed with him is about separating from the Church of England. Right? Massachusetts was Puritan. They didn't want to separate. And he was saying, no, we need to separate. So those things getting kicked out. So he leaves, forms his own colony. It was 1636 that happens. He actually gets 2 charters. The first one comes in 1644. He manages to slide it in the middle of all the turmoil. He gets another charter in 1663, and this is the one I want to mention is a little more significant. This one stated that there would be religious freedom in Rhode Island, not just religious toleration, really religious freedom. It actually stated that the government would have authority only in civil matters. The chief of police or the constable of the town wasn't going to come and arrest you if you didn't show up for church on Sunday or something like that. Would only have authority in civil matters. Okay. Yes?
You moved the first charter?
44 was the first. This one was 63. The first charter didn't have this language in it, and he wanted it there. So this colony of Rhode Island in time becomes a haven for Baptists, people that believe much like us, because they were persecuted everywhere. I mean, nobody liked the Baptists. So they flocked here. George Washington referred to this as the little Baptist state of Rhode Island because there were so many Baptists that flocked here because the government had no say in the church here at all. I mean, Virginia, Massachusetts, other places, as long as you agreed with the favored church, you were fine. Right? No place favored the Baptists, so they flocked here. So, what will we name the Baptist colony? Would it be John Landia or Baptistia or I don't know. I don't know what we call it, but it's not there. We don't have to worry about it. Okay, so 1663, Rhode Island. The next one is actually a pair, North and South Carolina, 1663. You might notice that same time frame. We have 62, Connecticut recognized, 63, Rhode Island given the second charter, here 63. All of these are connected with that same political turn of events of Charles II coming back in. Here, Charles II was wanting to reward some of the noblemen who had helped him get back in power. So there was a group of 8 men here, nobles in England, and he was wanting to give some sort of present to. So he gives them this land of Carolina. These nobles then organize things and come over and start 2 different settlements. One settlement is to the north part, one settlement is to the south part. And eventually they get split into 2 separate colonies. That split is in 1712 officially, that we get North and South Carolina. Initially it was just Carolina with these 2 separate settlements. Eventually we get it split. Okay, so North and South Carolina. All right, next one, New York, 1664. This is still King Charles II, not so much tied in with him just coming to the throne and that type of thing. But New York, a little bit of background. What's that? Oh, are you from New York? What part? Upstate. Okay, so you're still a sane New Yorker. All right. You don't hail from New York City. We might have to banish you from class or something. So, all right, New York. New York, the city here, basically, was originally settled by Sweden and then Holland. The Dutch were the ones, the Hollands were actually the Hollanders, the Dutchies, people from Holland. They were the ones actually in control at this point. They had a very, very strict political system, very little freedoms, really a bunch of very unhappy people. So in 1664, Charles II just sent over some ships and announced that it was now a British colony. And basically nobody argued. It's okay. The sitting governor, a guy named Stuyvesant, he's a little short, plump man. with a little too much energy. He was running around trying to get everybody to come and fight, and everybody in New York is saying, "Are you crazy?" they'll give us a little bit of freedom. Right? We want what they have more than what you're offering us. So there was no fight. They just sailed in. They declared you're now a British colony. Once Stuyvesant realized that there was nobody going to join him in this glorious crusade to drive out the Dutch, drive out the English, he gives up. And we get New York becoming a British colony. So that was 1664 that happens. Yes?
So when the Dutch came in, did that make New York New Amsterdam? Or did that happen?
It was New Amsterdam when they came in. Yeah, and the name changed after that.
Yeah.
So, yep.
Actually, there's talk right now we're splitting and becoming New Amsterdam and New York because the New York City area is
So big?
so big that when elections come, they're the ones that have a say.
Oh, so making its own state almost. Whew. Do we want 2 senators in Congress elected just by New York City? I think Bernie Sanders is liberal. Who knows? I really think we should split the country in 2 and let all the liberals go to one side, and we'll go to the other side. They can pick which side they want. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that. So it'd be the state of New Amsterdam and the state of New York. I'm sure all you guys in upstate New York would love that. You would, again, live in a free state.
Senators and everything are already from New York City anyways.
Yeah, so you're right. How could it be worse than Hillary Clinton? So. All right, so New York, 1664. All right, the next one is New Jersey, also 1664. All right, this is a piece of land that was acquired with New York, and the guy in charge of New York, his name was the Duke of York. He gives this land away to 2 different guys. If you want, their names George Carteret and Lord Berkeley. Anyway, the Duke of York gives away part of his land to this separate group of people, and they form their own colony there in New Jersey. All right, 1664. All right, then we have a little bit of break, and we don't pick up it in class. In chronology, we don't have another colony here till 1679, and that's New Hampshire. 1679, New Hampshire. All right, this is another split off of Massachusetts. So, if you can think of, everything from here up being Massachusetts. Right, that's the way it was originally. I mean, you see Rhode Island, Connecticut splitting off. Then New Hampshire, you can still see this is still Massachusetts at this point. It's called the District of Maine. Eventually get another state there. But this whole thing was Massachusetts. And we get New Hampshire splitting off here in 1679. Okay, so that's New Hampshire. Then the next one is 1682. Pennsylvania. This goes back to Charles II. He got himself in debt. Kings are good at that. So are presidents. He was in debt to a man named William Penn. So Penn agreed to be given a chunk of land in the New World to pay off the debt. So the king gave him this land. It was forested, so it began to be referred to as Penn's Forest, or Pennsylvania was the word for forest. And we just kind of meshed the 2 together. Pennsylvania. Okay, the guy that did that was William Penn. So he was a Quaker, and so Pennsylvania has early on a lot of religious freedom. The wording there was, it was free to all who could worship, and then this is the quote, the one almighty and eternal God. Does that include Allah? Well, they would claim it does. But anyway, a lot of religious freedom there with the Quakers. All right, one other comment here about Pennsylvania is that this colony grows very, very quickly. Philadelphia becomes one of the dominant cities by the time of the Revolution. So we see it developing quickly and becoming significant quickly. We're 1682, where other colonies have been around for 60 years or so. All right, Pennsylvania. Next one is Delaware. All right, Delaware. This is lost my spot here. William Penn. This is 1704. William Penn and the Duke of York, the guy in charge of New York, agree for William to take this piece of land. He wanted better access to the ocean for trade and that type of thing. So 1704, the Duke of York agrees to give this hunk of land to William Penn. William Penn decides to incorporate it, make it a separate colony rather than just extend Pennsylvania down there. So we get a separate colony of Delaware in 1704. All right, there's one colony left. What have we missed? Georgia. They don't come along until 1732. All right, here a man named James Oglethorpe wanted to create a colony for people in prison for debt. Yeah. The James or the Oglethorpe? James Oglethorpe. All right, so goes to the king. King George II at this point gives permission. And this colony is a complete failure. Not very many people in debt wanted to go there. It didn't work. Eventually, James, the thought was he would, the law put them in jail until they paid off their debt. He wanted to start this colony so they could be released from prison and come over here and work, start a farm and start raising crops and pay their debt off. So not many people ever did that. So James invites anybody else to come in. After 20 years, he just gives up completely and hands it back over to the king. It still stays as a colony, but doesn't stay in James's hand for very long. So King George had a completely ulterior motive for this. He wasn't driven by some philanthropic desire to help the poor and the needy. There was these nasty Spaniards down to the south of the English colonies, and he wanted a road bump, a speed bump or something there. If the Spanish ever went on a rampage, he wanted a buffer zone. So he was willing to let James go down and be that buffer zone. So he really wasn't wanting to help the poor, but it worked out. Okay.
So what year was Georgia?
1732. Okay, let me make 3 comments here, kind of generalizing some things from all of these colonies. There's some broad generalizations. I'm stealing these from your textbook, so hopefully at some point you recognize them. Location 1299. I don't know. Anybody reading it on their Kindle? The Kindle gives you locations, at least mine, not page numbers. So location 1299. All right, there's 3 generalities here about all of these colonies. First one is there was always a close connection between religious freedom and personal liberty, or at least generally speaking, a close connection between religious freedom and personal liberty. They were beginning to see it was impossible to restrict religious freedom and not also restrict personal freedom and liberty. So they connected those two. Okay, we also see here increasing economic freedom, right? Even greater than in England, economic freedom. A particular important facet here is land ownership. Many people being able to own land and having laws that secured your ownership of the land. It's easy for us not to appreciate that in a country where, I own my house and the land around it. I've got a deed. The county approves the deed and the description of the property. And if Zachary comes and builds a shed in the corner of my property and says, this is mine, the government is going to back my claim to owning the land. All right? There are lots of places where that's land ownership is not quite so secure. Right? The government doesn't always back it up, and it's a much more tenuous thing. But that idea of economic freedom, and especially here, clear ownership of property and property rights. So economic freedom. And then the third generality here is the political institutions that they create are similar to England, with one possible significant change. They began to be more and more aware that individuals needed protection from the government. The individual protection from the government. They began to be very concerned about that and incorporating that into their state, or at this point, colonial governments, trying to maintain protections for those individual freedoms against England, but increasing protection of the individual being protected from the government. Our current president has a completely warped view of everything in life, but also this. All right, he looks at the Bill of Rights as a what's this phrase? A negative list or something like that. It's a list of things that the government's not allowed to do for you. That's the way he looks at it, as opposed to a list of things the government's not allowed to do to you. I mean, it's protections for the individuals for the most part. And our founding fathers realized that the government, by its very nature, because the people that run the government are wicked, filthy sinners just like us, okay? And if you get a chance to abuse your position somehow, I don't know, is it still wrong to go down the center stairs in the dorm? Okay, ooh, big sin there. Are they still in the guys' dorm a little bit rickety and look like they might fall through with you? You've never, okay, good. Okay, I remember one point they were starting to look pretty rough. But if you see guys starting going up and down the stairs and nobody says anything, then you're gonna say, well, why should I not go up and down the stairs? And your sin nature. Somebody get to go up and down? You're the dormouse? Okay, yeah, he's special, right? Caleb's very special. All right, but our very nature is to always be looking for ways to pull stuff into ourselves, more power and authority. And the people in government are the same way. Okay, and our founding fathers realized that there needs to be some protections to keep the government from encroaching upon individual liberties and rights that are from God in their eyes, which I think is appropriate from God. So that begins to dominate. And definitely by the time we get to the Revolution, we see them incorporated, even that language, into the Declaration of Independence, that the government needs to be restricted and held back, and not, instead of taking away the individual rights, it needs to protect them. So anyway, that theme also dominates here in the colonies. Okay, questions on that? We now have 13 colonies. We almost have an America. And we've got, oh yeah, a lot of time here. Yeah, all right. Ready to talk about a war? Stephanie's always ready to talk about a war. She's a morbid fascination with killing men. All right, let's talk about the French and Indian War. Gregory, you're not supposed to be so vocal with that type of thing. All right, French and Indian War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War. It's in our timeline, which most of you hopefully remember the date from a week ago, 1756 to 63. There's lots of fun things to talk about here. We won't talk about them all, though. I will mention off starting that this is the last of 4 wars between England and France. They go at it here multiple times through this time frame, and this is the last one. Following this war, France is removed from North America. They lose control of Canada. They're gone. All right, so this is the last of 4. Some of the wars started in Europe, squabbles there between England and France, and bled this direction. This one actually goes the other direction. The squabbles and fight starts over here and bleeds over towards England. Anyway, this is the last of 4 of these. I want to read you a quote This is out of one of the prior ones. It's referred to as King William's War. It ended in 1697. I just want to read you a quote here that I've always found fascinating. This is a description, I forget the book I got it out of what happened here. All right, Mr. Dustin lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts. In 1697, he was working in a field with 7 of his children. Only 7. The others were at the house. When he heard the war whoop of the Indian warrior, he grabbed his rifle, jumped on a horse, and rode for the house, but discovered that the Indians were between him and the house. He cannot save his wife and the house. He told his children to run before him to the next nearest fortified house, and he delayed the Indians by shooting at them as they moved, and they made it safe. Now the story picks up with his wife. The Indians came into the house, took the baby by the ankles, and dashed his brains out against a tree. That's not the part that I find exciting. All right, they took Mrs. Dustin, a neighbor, and a boy who actually understood the Indian language, Algonquin. Took them away. The boy heard the Indians say that they would be tortured at the end of the journey. Mrs. Dustin decided to take matters into her own hands. So, girls, think about this. There were 9 Indians with them and 3 squaws. At night, while the Indians were asleep, the 3 captives took tomahawks and began smashing the brains out of the Indians. They killed 10 of them. One of the women and a small boy escaped. I must have my numbers wrong. It gets even better. Mrs. Dustin scalped the Indians. And the 3 made their way 100 miles back home. The reason why she scalped them is there was a bounty for Indian scalps. She got paid 50 pounds for bringing the scalps back home. The good old days of the frontier. I don't know, guys, I think it might be really nice to my wife. She comes home with these 10 scalps of the Indians that she just killed. I'll do the dishes. It's okay. Put the knife down. So anyway, that was one of the prior ones. I mean, there are many Indian raids. Not all of them did the wife return back home safe. Most of the time they got killed, but here at least is one exception. All right, let's talk about this particular one, the French and Indian War. At least get it started. We won't have time to finish, but at least get it started. All right, the first thing to mention is the causes of this particular war. Like I said, England and France, they were kind of just looking for excuses to try to kill each other. They'd already done this multiple times. This time, there were 3 things that got the ball rolling in this fight, and they stem out of the colonies in the New World. Okay, the first one was a fight over who owned the land. Right? Both sides claimed that the Ohio River Valley was theirs. That's where we are. Okay, this entire region, if you go west of the mountains, this entire region here was claimed by both England and France. The French actually, as far as boots on the ground and people actually being there, they had a lot of fur traders and things already traveling through the area. The English presence was relatively small, but still, both sides claimed the same piece of land. Okay? That always leads to fights. Zachary claims the corner of my property. I don't know, should I go to the government and do it legally or just begin blasting? I don't know. What's that? That's fine. I'll be in the house. So, all right, so a fight over the land. The second thing was a fight over the fur trade with the Indians. Not scalps from the Indians. The fur trade of small woodland rodents. What happened to the dorm the other night with the raccoon? All right, fur trading. There was a lot of money in fur trading. Okay, it wasn't just that they loved having dead animal skins around. There's a lot of money there. And both sides were trying to get the Indians to come to them and trade. All right, so they were at odds here over the fur trade. And then the last one was over fishing. Okay, fishing. Not what happens on the lake. We're talking here about commercial fishing off the coast of Newfoundland, from Virginia on up that way. Fishing rights there. Who could control the fishing? Again, there's lots of money there. And both sides wanted to control it. All right, so those things bring this thing to a head, and it boils over here in this particular French and Indian War. All right, let's at least get a little bit started here into the fighting. I have, as far as my notes are concerned, the start of the war, and then the next point is the struggle in the Ohio Valley. The initial onslaught, the initial wave of conflict is in the Ohio Valley, that particular land. So, okay, let's get a little bit started here. The French built a fort in this area called Fort, and I think I got this one right, Caleb, Duquesne? What's that? Sure. I'm going to quit asking. I have this pronunciation. I don't know if that's right or not. Fort Duquesne? Whatever. Duquesne. That fort right there, not this part. Forget the pronunciation. That part right there. This fort was right here. Can anybody read the name that's there now? Yeah, so it doesn't stay Fort Duquesne forever. Right? So the British do win this thing, but that's where it was. They began to build this thing right there in the Ohio River Valley. In 1753, the governor of Virginia decides to address this thing. His name was Dinwiddie. Unfortunate name for a governor. Governor that's too many D's, too many N's. Dinwiddie. One name, yeah. All right, so what he does is he sends a message up there to tell the French that they're on British soil and they need to leave. Okay, he wasn't, I don't think, really expecting it, but he was, getting the dialogue started. The guy he picks to deliver the message is George Washington. Right. This is really the start here of George Washington's rise to prominence and eventually authority. He was selected to deliver this message. He was only 21 years old, which seems ridiculously young. You guys probably have a slightly different opinion. Anybody 21 here? Okay. I mean, look, as young as Tamar, immature and completely useless. All right, anyway, very young man. You would typically, he was selected. It gives us an indication of his maturity and the responsibility that he was able to handle here. So, takes this trip in '53 to tell them that they're on American or British soil at that point. He doesn't lose. The next year, Dinwiddie puts together a military force to go after the fort. And he puts Washington in charge of this force. And this doesn't go so well for the British. Washington had a total of about 400 troops with him. Some British troops, mostly colonial troops. And as he's approaching the fort, the French leave the fort and attack him with about 1,500 troops. So it's not a real close run thing. Washington loses this battle. He built a fort you might have heard of called Fort Necessity, a very hastily built fort. As they were approaching, they realized that the French had left the fort and were coming to meet them. He scrambled to build some place to defend himself. He actually performs very well in the fight, and the troops perform very well in the fight. Some people criticize him. He surrenders to the French. I don't think it was it's an unfair criticism to do that with him. So, all right, let me mention one. We'll look at it next time. There's a couple things to talk about along the trip. He learned some interesting things that helps him later in life. So, all right, we will pick it up next time.